Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a manuscript editor, a writing coach, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one to one with me, and I'm one to one with Dana Killion. She's a memoirist, she's a novelist, and we're going to talk primarily about her memoir, but also about her writing. Her memoir is raw and vulnerable about the 25 years that she spent with an alcoholic and adulterer as well. And what an incredible story it is on how she dealt with that. So, Dana, welcome to One to One.
Thank you, John. I'm so happy to be here.
I have this, you've probably been asked this question a gazillion times, and it's probably insensitive, but I know a lot of people ask this question. And that is, look, the guy was an alcoholic, and you were with him probably for 3 years before you really realized how bad the situation was. You stuck with him. You actually were in a position to help him get sober.
Mhm,
And then you realized how much of a cheat he had been.
mhm.
And so you still stuck with him for 20 years. And I know that that happens a lot. And so my question is sort of two-pronged. Why? Why did you stay so long? And how were you able to extricate yourself from that? I mean, that must have been an excruciating decision.
Well, thank you for easing into the questions.
Right. All downhill from here.
This is the question that I've asked myself a lot too. And one of the things that happens when you are in these kinds of situations, the alcoholism, I learned a couple years into the marriage. And unlike many alcoholics, he was a very high functioning drunk. So it's something that eases up. It's not like every day is this horrendous experience. You have these conversations, he works a little, he tries a little, and then you go back to where you were and you throw another solution. It becomes this process. But it really was not an experience of drunken fights and ugliness and all of the things that we stereotypically think of when we think of an alcoholic. He was high functioning. He needed booze, but it wasn't about quantity. It was about the frequency.
And because it wasn't what you expected, did that throw you and, in a sense, delay the ultimate decision to leave?
It delayed everything. It delayed his acceptance. It delayed my understanding. When you love someone, you don't just walk away quickly.
Right.
And addiction is a illness. And when you have somebody who is going through all of the things that he should be doing, trying to improve, trying to get sober, working it, you stay because you love this person and you're deep in the relationship by the time it's all playing out. If this had been a situation where he was constantly defiant, constantly diminishing my concerns, sometimes people get violent. There was none of that. It was, here is this wonderful, amazing man. We have this amazing relationship. But oh, by the way, there's this problem over here.
Mhm.
He has some emotional illness here that he's having trouble facing and trouble getting his hands around. But the other thing that happens when you're in these situations is that you start to get a little bit afraid to leave because it feels like his life is in your hands. What's going to happen to him if I leave? I'm the person holding it all together. I'm the person standing between life and death. And that may be a false way to look at it, but it is the reality of many of us who've been in these addiction situations, addictive relationships, where we are trying to navigate for our family and we're trying to save the person that we love. So it's a process of how far is he going to go? How far am I going to go? And figuring out when your breaking point comes in. And that's a hard thing to do.
Well, but then he really was making an effort
Mhm.
and was going to AA meetings and seemingly had turned his life around. And then you discover adultery. And I mean, not just, a lapse. We're talking serial adultery, correct?
Yeah.
And that must have been a major body blow.
It was one of the probably the most painful stage of my life. We were at a point with his addiction where there was one last thing to try, and that is inpatient rehab. We were 20 years into the marriage at that point. He had worked in a situation where it was very difficult to step out of work for 6 weeks
Yeah.
without being public. And that was the last thing in the world that he would do is be public and say, hey, I'm an addict, I'm off to rehab.
Mm,
Job changed, and we were at a point of, you need to go to rehab now, or I'm going to end this marriage. You
mm.
can choose vodka or you can have me. That's where we were.
Was it
So,
hard to get to that point?
oh, of course. Like I said,
And
this
what
20
allowed
years
you
in,
what allowed you to get to that point where you were willing to end it?
because it was the last promise.
What do you mean?
Well, we had gone through this long process where he had seen therapists on and off, gone through stages where he was not drinking, working it, but it was never successful for more than a few months at a time. He wanted very much to try to do this on his own
Mm.
and promised me that if it were not successful, he would do rehab. We got to the point where there was no more excuses on rehab. This is it. You've tried everything else. You now are in a career situation where you can disappear and nobody's going to know. Your ego will not be hurt. You have to do that, or I can't continue anymore. It was like the last moment for me of a promise that you've made. Show me you're real. Show me it's the truth. Show me that that's what you're willing to do because we've done everything else.
And what happened?
So he went to rehab. Um, and at the end of his rehab stay, that's when I learned about his serial infidelity. I didn't know during the marriage. There had been one drunken night in a hotel on a business trip that he had been forced to fess up to. Um, but that's all he had ever fessed up to. And regardless of what we did or talked about, I was trying to give him the grace. What it turned out was he was using that situation to tell me about it as the one that he thought would be most palatable to be.
And
When
how did you react?
I was in shock, utter shock. I maybe should not have been. I don't know. I mean, there is an aspect of you're married to an alcoholic. You've known about one sexual encounter. I thought we had done the work to discuss, to deal with my insecurities, his openness and honesty about what he was doing, who he was with, all of those difficult things that anybody does after infidelity. And I had cautiously continued in the relationship. But when that awareness came in, that this had been a pattern throughout the marriage, that he, to be blunt, did not know how many sexual partners he'd had.
Oh my.
Um,
Woof.
it just knocked me flat. I can't, I don't even know how to put words to it.
And how long did you suffer in silence once that revelation came about?
A long time, a long time. And this is probably the part that is most hard, most difficult for me to understand about myself or to explain. I spent a year after that knowledge numb. I remember very little of what happened in the year that followed. other than my mother also died
Mm.
not long after. I remember passing out from the stress. Those were the moments that were in my life, and those are the moments that I remember. I was simply frozen in shock. And at the same time as disgusted and horrified I was by his behavior, I also knew that this man had just gotten sober for me. He had gotten
Okay.
sober to save our marriage.
Um, this is a personal question. You
Go ahead.
don't have to answer it. Did you consider suicide?
No,
Why
no,
not? Why not? Why not?
it's not part of my makeup. I am not someone who has ever been at the place where I believe it is hopeless. There's always a path.
So how were you then able to find a path? Did you go through therapy? Was there a spiritual dimension? What was the lifeline?
So there were a number of things that were going on. His therapy was continuing. My therapy was continuing. We had many, many conversations about trust, and I put into place some buffers, if you will.
What do you
We
mean?
we did a post-nut document that we handled our finances,
Mhm.
and I made him propose the terms. What are you willing to put on the line? If you lie to me again, if you cheat again, if you drink again, put it on the line. And that felt actually really empowering to me. It wasn't an attorney saying, here, here, here. It was me saying to him, if you want me to stay in my life, in your life, if you are as committed as you tell me you are to fixing this emotional problem and our relationship, show me,
Did he?
prove it. Oh, absolutely. He became a model husband. I mean, both in the document we prepared, the therapy that he continued, his attentiveness, his compassion, his willingness to discuss as best he could. Um, but this is a process for the alcoholic too, or anybody stepping outside when their patterns of behavior have been lying. This has been avoidance. So these are patterns that have to be unlearned. And I had to unlearn patterns of thinking of him as a drunk. So everything was changing. We were together committing to trying to work through something that I think intellectually we both knew was not salvageable. But the reality was there was still so much love
And
that we wanted to try.
how long did that phase last?
That from the time I learned of his sexual behavior to the time I ended the marriage was 5 years. I know, I know. And again, I will be the first one to say I can't explain that well. Any sane, more emotionally balanced individual would have run screaming for a divorce attorney, and a really nasty one at that. And I didn't. And part of it was the love that we still felt for each other. And that had to die a bit to be born.
Mm. Mhm. Okay. In fact, I didn't tip you off to this ahead of time, but there's a passage that you've written about love, and I mean, I can read it if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is on page 218 of your memoir, and it says, "What I do believe is that love is precious. It doesn't find us easily or often, but when it does enter our lives, it should be exchanged freely, nurtured, and fought for. Love is stubborn. It refuses to fade quickly. It takes a toehold and hangs on for dear life as it should. But love can also destroy. It can exist even when it siphons the love out of us, leaving an empty shell, a void filled with false promises, and one who has been diminished at another's expense. Love is not something to be suffered through. It is something to be mutually cherished. If that love is harmful and one-sided, it is brave and necessary to leave it behind for the dream and promise of another chance, for the dream of something equal and honest. Real love, special love, is always worth waiting for. You just have to be ready to recognize it. It isn't the question I expected to be contemplating on the eve of my 25th anniversary, but will that love ever find me? Or will I again allow want to blind me?
I'm tearing up hearing my own words.
It's this is very powerful. And that was, 25, that was on your what, 25th
Birthday.
anniversary? That was
Yeah,
that from your journal? Did you write that
I did.
on? Okay.
I did. I
And
did.
then what happened?
Are you talking about or asking about the decision to leave and how I got there?
Yeah.
I think the impetus to face everything was COVID.
Hmm.
COVID did a lot to many of us, and one of the things that it did to me is when you take away all those distractions of life, the going out to lunch, or you're meeting with friends, or let's go see a movie, whatever it is, we all have things that distract us from our own thoughts and the depth, the evaluation of our life. With COVID, I didn't have any of that. It was the two of us. And I had a lot of time to think, as we all did. And one of the things that I realized, that despite what we hoped, that the depth of our love could be restored, could come back, it wasn't going to. What I felt, the emptiness that I felt because of what had happened into the relationship, because of what was happening in COVID that magnified it, I realized that emptiness was going to be permanent if I stayed in this relationship. I still loved him. I knew he loved me, but it could never be what it was. And we would be existing, not living, not loving. And I wanted more than that. I wanted the baggage off my shoulders. And
So
to
what
do
so
that meant
what so
stepping
what
out
did
on.
so what did you do?
So we started the divorce proceedings and all of the things attached to that. And I had to make a decision about where I was going to live. And what I did was I moved across country, bought a house in Tucson, knew no one here, to start my life in a place that was totally new for me. I'd visited, but I didn't know a soul when I moved here. It
That,
seemed
that
like
must have
a
been that
necessary.
must have been frightening, or was it liberating, or both?
At the time, it was probably more liberating. It felt, part of what I experienced, and I think anybody in an addictive relationship, is you don't have control. And you spend a lot of your time feeling that your life is not your own, because your life revolves around the addiction, whether it's managing your children, whether it's managing him. What's going to happen to us now? Is he going to crash the car? Our finance is going to go to hell. All of those things are what we experience and live with. So this was something that was liberating to me, because I could go anywhere. I just had to figure out where. And then I had to take the steps of, how do I forge a new life? What do I do to make a life my own that hadn't been mine in a long time?
And how difficult was it to, in a sense, rebuild that life?
It took time. It took time. Um, I bought a home that was very special. It was very cloistered feeling, courtyard, view of the mountains. It was very private. And I took on a remodeling project in that home. And that was, one, important for me because I like that, but also because it made it mine. And it gave me something to do to
There's a
feel
metaphor. There's a
vulnerable.
metaphor there, right?
There is.
Rebuilding yourself.
And you may remember the chapter about a house in the book.
Yeah.
That wasn't the house I bought, but yes, using the home as metaphor of can a house be part of your identity? Can it renew you? Can you instill love into it if it hasn't been there? So yes, very much a metaphor. So I was working on those things, remodeling, and trying to figure out what I was going to do with the journal material that became the memoir.
Well, interesting that you should mention that. So let's the writing is exquisite, and in fact the second half is actually poetic, and I get the impression, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong, I got the impression reading it that this was like a dam bursting, that it just came out on. I mean, obviously I know from being a writer myself that, it goes onto the page, but it doesn't go on the page perfectly. And yet the way it's assembled on the page has that feel of it being just an explosive way of working through your emotions. There's a tremendous emotional power in what you've written, that is tremendously vulnerable. And I mean, I don't know you well, but my impression is that you're a fairly reserved, perhaps even introverted person. And so now here you are sharing some incredibly personal and painful things.
Yeah.
Why would you do such a thing? And what talk about the process. I mean, how difficult was it to write, or was it not difficult and it just poured out of you?
I eased into this. As we mentioned, I was working on a journal. I was using the journal as a tool to deal with the emotions. 1 week, an hour of therapy every week was just not enough to deal with what I was dealing with. And I needed a vehicle to vent, to just say all the ugly things, the hurtful things, the pain. And being an author, I was toying with the idea, what do I do with this material? But can I write this?
Mm-hmm.
But I knew that I didn't have to make the decision right away. So I played with the idea, used the journal, wrote a first draft. Nobody had to see it. I could throw it away if I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
But I finished that first draft. I set it aside and then picked it up again, like you always should with any of your books.
Mm-hmm.
But what I realized when I read that first draft is that I had not told my truth. I used distanced language. I skipped over the most vulnerable parts of the story, trying to protect myself, because you're absolutely right. I am a private person. I am not someone who shoves it all out in the world the way I ultimately did. But then I had to sit with that draft and I had to make a decision. Have I done enough therapy just by writing it? Is that the purpose of attempting to write a book? And as I sat with it, I came to the conclusion that if I could find my voice to tell my truth and to tell it no holds barred, then maybe I could help other people who'd been in the experience too. Because I know that part of being on the sidelines of addiction is silence, this fear of telling your story, this fear of letting people know what you're experiencing because of our loyalty to our partners, because of the shame, because of all the judgment. It's a really vulnerable thing. And so many sober partners were like I was, and they said nothing.
What have you learned about fear from having written this?
I can do anything.
Whoa, whoa! Tell me more.
Well, this is a process. As I said, it's a journal that, okay, here's a draft. And what's the next date? Okay, it's a book. Now, who do I show it to? What is the publishing path? I got to show more people. Okay, it's going to be published. I got to talk to an editor. There's all these other people coming into the story, coming into my life, hearing and reading things that I'd experienced that I still wasn't talking about with people really close to me. Not all of it yet.
Mhm.
And each step was one step forward. And as the book was about to be released, then we go into the PR stuff. And I have to talk about this on radio or
Right.
podcasts or TV. I have to write articles. And each of those things got me more comfortable, got me more confident, not only in speaking about it, but as I did this and as individuals and readers got in touch with me and thanked me
Mhm.
for saying the things that they couldn't say, it was this reinforcing process. I
Because
have gone through
you could easily have, turned and run away, but instead you decided to go forward anyway.
I
Let me
did.
ask you this: how are you different now, having gone through what you did, having written what you did? How are you different now, and is that a surprise?
Am I surprised by it? Yes, I'm surprised by the extent of the change. I have always been somebody that was the quiet little voice on the side of the room. I kept my head down. I did my work. I was the good little girl as a kid. And to step forward like this and to say things that are making some people in my life uncomfortable and are making other people uncomfortable because they want to challenge whether it was my story to tell instead of his. It's shown me that I don't care about those opinions. My truth, what happens to us, is just as valid as what the addict is experiencing. And far too often, there is more. We think we're protecting ourselves by staying silent. In fact, we are digging a deeper hole and often doing more damage to ourselves because the hole becomes inside of us too.
Now, you never name your ex in
I
in the memoir, and I'm wondering if there's any has he read it? Has there been any blowback?
So I chose not to name him, and I had pushback on that from my publisher. They wanted me to give him a fake name. They thought, this is dumb. Your husband, your husband, your husband. But it was an intentional thing for me. I wanted to minimize him. This is my story. You want to write yours? Go right ahead. Um, Blowback? Well, has he read it? Of course not.
Not
He is
necessarily.
aware. He is aware of it.
Okay.
I called him and told him before I had my first publicity thing, and he was
How
not
did he
happy.
how did he react? He
He hung up on me.
Okay.
He hung up on me.
Was that the last time you talked?
We we spoke after that, after another family event that required conversation.
Yeah.
But no, he wants to pretend this is not him, not his life.
Has he remarried?
No,
Okay. And have you?
no.
This is another one of these DeDakis impertinent questions, but um, I would not be surprised if you're cynical about men.
Hmm. I prefer to think of it as extremely high standards.
As I say, cynical about men.
I I can't always tell liars on sight, but I can recognize self-centeredness in men. And that is something I watch for immediately as men think they want to date me. So they don't.
Oh, I mean, there was a writing class I taught, and there was a woman who was writing a book on 100 first dates. And I remember
Oh,
asking her, "Is there a trend? Are you finding a trend?" She said, "Men do not know how to have a conversation with a woman." It's all about them. They're not curious about you at
Right.
all. All they care about is impressing you with their bank account, and their title.
Yes, I that is an issue. That would be a whole nother podcast if we want to talk about that stuff, but,
Well, and I mean, let me ask this, and this is sort of a sharp turn, but not, and that is we've just come through an incredibly contentious political season, and Donald Trump has been elected for a second term, uh, and a lot of women voted for Donald Trump. I mean, my question is there a comparison? I mean, I know you're politically active, and I'm wondering, is there a comparison between a woman staying with an addict and a woman voting for Trump, sort of like, a bad boyfriend or a bad spouse you just can't get over? What is there a comparison here?
I'm not sure. My guess would be that we are still in an era of far too many relationships take on what they believe are very traditional roles, whether they're conscious of them or not. We saw that in the push for women, you don't have to tell your husband who you voted for, and men getting horribly offended that they couldn't control that. There are a lot of women who are financially dependent, and that keeps them following along. I think there is a rhythm that we get into in relationships. It's comfortable. It may not be the best thing in our life, but there is a comfort and change, big change like ending a marriage. It's damn hard. And it's very difficult for women if they're concerned about how they're going to support themselves, what their life is like, how do I make these decisions? Not everybody can make the decision that I did to move cross country and buy a house and forge a life. That is a tough thing
Mhm.
to face in many relationships.
What kind of advice do you give women who are in dire straits and that they don't necessarily have the financial freedom that you had to make the decision you made, which was difficult to begin with? But I mean, in many cases, a woman deciding to leave a marriage, that could end their life.
Correct. Correct. And we're unfortunately still, that is our state of the world in terms of income, financial gains, roles, all of it's all very complicated. Having children, being primary caregivers for children, it is complicated. And I do run into that a lot with the women who read my book and get in touch and say, this is me, but I can't leave him. I know I
Mm,
should.
mm.
And so the conversation, and I'm not here to be a therapist,
Right.
but what I would advise anyone in that situation is if you think you need to leave at some point, start putting money aside. Take really good notes of what's happening in your relationship.
Why?
Well, if you're going to get a divorce, it might get ugly. Um, there are a lot of women I know whose husbands, whose partners have hidden money from them. So get your hands on all the financial statements. Understand and document, particularly if there are difficult things that are deserving of divorce. This is not just we don't care about it, we don't love each other anymore. If there's addiction or abuse or anything substantial, that is going to come up in a divorce hearing. So have your notes. It's awful, but
And are
and
women
find somebody to talk to.
receptive when you say these things?
There is a push-pull when you are in the moment.
Yeah.
It was there for me. It is there in the women I interact with, which is, I still love this person. I would like to get to the place where we can figure it out. Is he ever going to get sober? And we don't want to accept the reality that maybe he's not. Or we think we're doing the right thing because our kids are still around and that we need to stay together for the kids, not realizing that we may be turning our children into addicts
Hmm.
because this is the role that they see. Whether it's the addiction, maybe they don't see the addiction, but they're seeing mommy being treated badly. Maybe. Are they seeing that? And No one can make these decisions alone, and no one can make these decisions before you're ready to make them. There's something really important about being emotionally ready to take this step because it's hard.
If a person is alone, and as you say, they shouldn't be, they really should find some support. What kind of suggestions do you have on the kind of support that would be helpful so that they're not alone?
Mhm. I have become a huge, huge believer in journaling. And I know a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that idea. A journal is a real thing. It can be read, it can be found. But the value of writing down these things and getting them out of your heart, out of your head, even if you rip that page out and throw it in a shredder, is invaluable. It makes it real in a different way. And if you can find a way to keep that journal and you start looking back through those pages like I did and go, oh my God, reality is staring me in the face here. I can't pretend anymore.
But
Value.
journaling is still a lonely process.
It is lonely, but it's
What
a
about
starting point.
bringing others in?
The other point is a therapist or a really, really, really trusted friend. You need a confidant. It can be a professional if that's too, one way or the other. It doesn't really matter what works for you. Find someone who can advise you. The beauty of a therapist is that they have no emotional ties to what you do.
Right.
They are there to show you where you're hurting, help you answer the questions. They're there to be the mirrors, to push you forward to your own questions and your own decisions. So therapy is, if you can afford it and you can do it, go there.
Yeah. Uh, this is fascinating, and I really hope that a lot of people are helped and encouraged by this, because obviously you've walked a long road, a troubled road. You have documented it. It is now out there. And the interesting thing is that before you were a memoirist, you were and still are a novelist. And I find it interesting is in that lies are in the word lies is in every title of your 5 books. So is that a coincidence?
Certainly not.
And obviously, I mean, Lies in High Places is your first novel. It came out in, I think, what, 2017,
Correct.
which obviously you were in the middle of this awful situation with your husband, but you were far from having made a break. So how much of your personal life flows into your fiction writing?
Well, you're absolutely right. Lies was intentionally used, and that was a metaphor. Maybe metaphor isn't the right word, but it was a direct tie between what was happening in my personal life, the lying. And so I used the fiction. I couldn't yet tell my personal story, but I had little moments where I could pull that in, whether it was setting, because these are based in Chicago and I was living there. Um, but I think the biggest tie is the character that I created as the protagonist wasn't me exactly, but she was a version of me that I wanted to be at that point, but was not. She could be that kick-ass, take no prisoners person that I wasn't yet. She could always get to the bottom of the lies when I couldn't. So she became a little bit of an alter ego for me. As I was testing out who I was and learning to write, um, using this process as a distraction,
Mhm.
using the process to work out some of the things that were going on in the back of my head that I couldn't quite be direct ties.
And your protagonist is a journalist. Why
Yes,
that?
yes.
Because that's not your background.
It is not my background. When I decided that I wanted to write, I analyzed what I liked to read. It was always mystery or thriller, series fiction, female protagonist, first person point of view.
Mhm.
So I set to create a character. I created her and the character first, and I wanted to create a job for her that would allow me to write whatever I wanted, let me get into whatever cases and stories I could without needing a tremendous amount of technical knowledge. I'm not a cop. I'm not an FBI agent. I can't pretend to be. Journalist, I can pretend to be. I can learn enough to dig in to make her persistent with the questioning. And I created the situation for her where she, in the course of how her company is structured, she can do whatever she wants. Her desire is to expose the lie. And yes, that led into memoir, Exposing the Lies.
And I would imagine therapeutic and cathartic at the
Yes,
same time, right?
yes. It's a different process writing fiction and going into memoir. I probably wouldn't have written memoir if I hadn't done the fiction first.
Which is easier?
They're so different. They're so different.
Uh,
The writing process was quite different. As you pointed out in memoir, my language changed.
oh, what do
I
you mean?
had a there's far more lyrical, poetic language in the memoir than there is in my fiction. I
Mm.
didn't know I had that in me until I started working on the memoir.
Hmm. One of the things that's interesting, Liar's Code, The Liar's Code is your most recent novel, I think. Am I
That's
right?
correct.
And there's an interesting story that goes with that cover.
Yes. Yes. So my cover designer is based in New Zealand, and she has no understanding of what my politics are. We simply use imagery from the Chicago skyline. When I got this cover, we were putting this book out in 2022. I immediately recognized the building, and that building is Trump Tower, Chicago. So it became this little inside joke. Anybody that knows my politics knows that I am a firm, very liberal Democrat, and to have the image of Trump Tower on a book titled The Liar's Code is just this wonderful little bit of unintended poetry for me.
Nice. Very nice. It's going to be a rough 4 years. Any
Mm.
thoughts on that?
I I'm terrified. I don't
Why?
know how else
Why?
to
Why?
describe what I'm feeling right now.
Why?
Trying to figure out how bad is it going to be. I hope it's not as bad as my imagination takes me.
And do you think that women are in particular jeopardy?
I think anybody that is not a white man ready to kiss the ring is in jeopardy.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. One of the things that I've also discovered, and you talk about it a little bit in your memoir as well, is painting,
Yes.
which has been a creative outlet for you. In fact, I'm going to go to let me put you in the solo shot there because that is your work behind you,
It is.
which is great. Talk a little bit about your painting.
I've always been a artsy, creative person, but during COVID, I got pretty serious about painting. And what I do is I love the expressiveness of bold mark making. But something that I do and started during that stage is I started embedding. So this is a tie where my writing and my painting tie in. I started embedding little secrets in my painting.
Hmm.
So I was going through this emotional crisis about what was happening in my marriage and didn't know how to get out of it. And I started this wonderful process that I continue this day where there's a little secrets that I write into the painting and I cover it up and it's just my little, maybe you can see part of a word, but it's an expression, a physical expression for me that is just a different part of my brain.
Can you
But
give
like
me any? Can
writing,
you give
it's
me any?
problem solving.
Can you give me an example of something that you bury in a painting?
Um, let's see, this painting is titled In a Way That Will Be Perfect. And that has meaning for me that I'm not going to share. But so I hide things about desire. I hide things about fantasy. I hide things that only make sense to me. Things that were like hidden in my journal that I maybe didn't write, or just a little phrase that without the context, you don't know what it means. But I would.
But isn't that part of what the original problem was, hiding things?
I think, yes. But for me, it's more of, I think I was hiding things that were still too vulnerable for me to talk about. So it was a way for me to put them into the world, but obscure them enough so I didn't feel exposed.
And if I can put a finer point on it, it's that difference between shame and owning something.
That's a good way to look at it. Yes. Yes. So I'm easing towards owning it, perhaps. I mean, owning it would just big, bold letters, but
But we're all works in progress. And I think
we are works in progress.
and I mean, I think that's sort of the takeaway for me from reading the memoir and from our conversation is that, people are very fluid, I guess you could say. They're complex. It's not a neat and tidy life that we live, and part of it is trying to figure things out and to have meaning in our lives, and that's a process of discovery.
It is. We are constant, or we should be constantly discovering and learning about ourselves. We need to be adaptable. We need to shift when the world shifts around us, or when we are feeling empty and alone, and recognize those feelings. And then we have to take ownership of what are we going to do about it. There's nothing worse to me than seeing someone who has remained broken and empty for years or decades because they're too afraid.
Is this something that is gender neutral? In other words, is this true of men and women?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have all kinds of techniques for hiding our emotional state. I mean, that's what drinking is all about. It's about avoidance. It's about not wanting to face something.
Right.
And ultimately, my former husband's sexual behavior was a similar thing. I don't like myself, so I got to find ways to feel good. And we all do this. So that moment in time where I was talking about, where I had this draft and I had to make the decision, do I write it in the way it needs to be written and work towards publishing, or do I hide it in the drawer? That is the decision that I had to make for my own emotional healing, and in doing so, to help others, which would be that feedback loop for me.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
So the next thing is, I'm just at early stages of a new book. And that new book is my first true nonfiction. I am working on a book about being emotionally resilient. The working title is Becoming Unbreakable. So personal growth, mindset, I don't know how you like to throw those
It sounds
labels.
almost like it might be self-help.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know the fine points of the classification of those books, but yeah, it's in that self-help personal growth category of books.
And yet, because you now have some personal momentum in terms of sharing of yourself, I can't imagine that you wouldn't bring elements of your own personal life into it as well. Am I right?
Yeah, that's how I'm structuring the book. I've had more than my share of traumas, the ones that we've talked about, some that we haven't. And what I realized as I was contemplating what to do next, I'm not in a place right now emotionally where I feel like writing about death for entertainment is appealing.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not done working on the subjects in the memoir, but I don't feel the compulsion to do another memoir.
How
So what do I do in between?
Yeah. How far along are you in this particular
Early
project?
stages. I've got the book is mapped out, fully outlined, and I'm about 6,000 words into the piece.
That's not very far.
It is not. It is not far.
Well, I'm interested in seeing how it goes, and I
Thank
hope that when it sees the light of day,
Yes,
you'll come back and we can
love
talk
that.
more about this.
But yes, I use the personal traumas. Here's the thing that happened. This is what I learned, and how it took me to the next step when the next trauma. And it's a process of learning to become resilient.
So I'm assuming people can contact you through your website, which is danakillion.com. Am I right?
That's correct. Please do.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
Thank you so much. And to anyone who is struggling with any of the issues that we talked about today, there is a path here. Contact me. I can help you. I can
Okay.
direct you to things. You are not alone in this.
Well, this has been wonderful. We've been talking with Dana Killion. She's a memoirist, a novelist. I'm John DeDakis. You've been one-to-one with me. And Dana, thank you very much. To be continued,
My
ma'am.
pleasure.